So welcome back to the Be Better Club. Today is February 14th, 2022. And on our schedule for our Spring 22 discussions has been this topic that I've called morally neutral or morally neutered. I suggested listening to a podcast from the podcast series called The Argument about whether or not new universities can fix what's seen as academia's free speech problem. This is a case that's been in the news a lot, and so the podcast focuses on the University at Austin, which is a newly minted approach, I guess, to higher education that's trying to get off the ground, that's really started by a bunch of politically conservative critics of traditional universities. You can read more about that online if you'd like. You can listen to the podcast. There's a link, of course, on the Be Better Club discussion thread on our website. But we got thinking about this topic because last semester, you might remember we talked about House Bill 233 and sort of what's happening in Florida around questions of free speech and higher education. And the podcast we listened to last semester, which I reviewed today, really focused on, I guess, the idea of cancel culture and how that's really just like political correctness from the 80s in new packaging. But the idea that there's I don't know, something going on here that's where values sort of orient the group or the collective towards one read on a situation and not some other read. And I don't know what I think about this, and this is why I think it's an important topic for Be Better Club, but just to give you a little bit of what was going on in that podcast last semester, they talked about all sorts of cases that made the news, like, you know, J.K. Rowling's stuff she says on social media, and then there's this case of Amy Cooper, the New York City dog walker, Karen, quote unquote, who was recorded sort of lambasting and calling the police on a Black citizen who asked her if she could put her dog on a leash. And there's this back and forth, right? There's a whole group of journalists and I guess conservative thinkers who sort of say, well, that's not really the whole story, right? There's got to be more to it. All we're getting is this little one person's phone perspective of the situation and not the whole story. And so the idea here is that there's this nuance to these narratives that get told that are grounded in values, right? They're oriented by values. And at the end of that podcast, I can't think of his name right now, but the guest on the podcast last semester said, we overestimate the dangers of social change and underestimate the backlash to social change. And I really thought that was a compelling idea, the idea that, you know, the pushback we often see, whether it's from the left or the right, politically speaking, is around the overestimation of the dangers of social change. That could be about, you know, liberal voices in the academy, or it might be about race or gender issues or whatever is hot at the moment culturally. We overestimate the dangers and we underestimate the backlash. And so that got me thinking this semester about, well, okay, so let's situate that in the context of universities. And so the podcast episode from The Argument was about free speech on campus. So again, it focused on around this issue of the University at Austin, and it brought together two voices. This guy, Mark Koplovich, who's a full professor of political science at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Sort of big elite public school in Wisconsin. And Greg Lukianoff, who is a co-author with Jonathan Haidt, interestingly, on this book they wrote in 2014 called The Coddling of the American Mind, which is a play on the book The Closing of the American Mind. There's a long story there, perhaps. So it's this conversation between basically a well-entrenched professor in the academy and a well-respected institution, and this guy who's functionally a conservative critic of universities. And they had this whole really interesting back and forth. And there was a lot to talk through in terms of what they were saying back and forth. And it's hard to do that when it's just me. And again, I'm grateful, Shelley, for your being here. I know you're in the car and driving, and so can't engage directly, but I feel like I should have pauses where I say, yes, that's very interesting. And then we can edit in you saying something later on. Anyway, the free speech issue, this conversation between these two voices going on in the podcast was, the podcaster asked these two, like, what's exciting and what's problematic about new institutions. And so the well-entrenched academic said, well, they're silly, right? Because starting a new university, like the idea is like, we're fed up with what's going on, we're just going to start our own, is a silly idea because universities are incredibly time and resource intensive, really complicated bureaucratic machines that need to get set up. And so, either it's going to become, this professor said, another Liberty University, which is a very well-known, very conservative institution with a big conservative bias, or it's just going to become another elite liberal arts institution like everybody else and have the exact same problems. And he said, there's really no way out of that trap. The other side of this conversation, Lukyanov said, well, it's exciting because it allows for new ideas. And again, these positions are theirs, not mine. But he said, it's exciting for the new ideas because institutions aren't that diverse. And the evidence he offered was that only 3%, and I don't know where these numbers came from, we'll have to vet them, but only 3% of faculty at Harvard are considered conservative. And I found that really interesting because what's happening in that response is that diversity of ideas is now, the set of diversity ideas is directly overlapping the set of differences, right? So we can't be diverse without including conservative voices. And that's a really interesting position to take. I have some strongish feelings about whether it's the right position to take, but I think it's compelling that what some people think is left out, maybe a small set of loud voices think is left out of the contemporary university, is conservative viewpoints. Now, the podcast goes on and they go back and forth for a while, and I'll draw your attention just to sort of one big thing here, and that was a point that Kopovich made that I thought was really compelling, and that was him as a political scientist. He's focused on the discipline of political science and what he should be teaching his students in terms of, the relevant conversations to enter into and the relevant factual knowledge to take on board and all of this stuff. But he's doing that in a time of increasing political divisiveness so that everyone has on political lenses. So his worry was that what's being sought is a balance not of diversity of viewpoints, but a balance of truth and misinformation, because on his read, at least, what's seen as conservative values in the US is equated with functionally false information. Now, again, I'm not making any claims here. I think I'm trying to map the terrain of this conversation in the podcast, but the idea that's being exemplified by these two is this idea that the university is supposed to be morally neutral and epistemically neutral, and the worry is that it's becoming morally neutered, right? The idea that if we're trying to find a balanced view and see both sides of an argument, we can't allow our students to take a position in a politically charged environment because it just closes off the other side of that argument. And then, of course, there's this back and forth, right? There's the conservative view, I guess, based on these two is, what's happening is this moral neutering of universities because only one moral perspective is being shared. And on the other side is the neutrality view is, no, we want people to see every side of it, of the conversation, but within the constraints, within epistemic constraints. We don't want to let in misinformation and false claims just for the sake of political balance, if that makes sense. Now, again, I don't know if this setup of this argument is the right setup to have, but I think it's really interesting that there's this tension going on in perceived political bias in higher education. And it's directly relevant to us who are living here in Florida, who are living through this political moment where a lot of state legislation and state pressures are being put on us to worry about these things directly. And it's not just a Florida problem, although it sometimes feels like it, it's a national concern. The conservative voice of this podcast, Lukyanov, said towards the end of this thing that he found it interesting, in his words, that the US has strong free speech laws, but weak free speech culture. And the response to that claim from the other side of the argument was, well, sure, I mean, that's always a problem, but universities handle that tension better than any other institutions in the country. So sure, there are still these problems about the boundaries of free speech. But that's not a critique of higher education. That's just a critique of culture in general. Now, all of this is interesting because of its ethical implications. The idea that there's a moral underpinning to the work we do at the university. whether that's in the Be Better Club, a group of folks interested in ethics, whether it's in philosophy, or whether it's in chemistry, right? That there's moral underpinnings to the work that's going on across the university. And I think that's a really interesting position to take, because it's a position that affects all of us. A lot of my STEM colleagues, I think, would push back if they were here and say, well, wait a second, if I'm doing chemistry or mechanical engineering or computer science or something, like, yeah, sure, there are values that I hold as an individual, but they don't affect my science. My science is neutral, objective, right? But of course it's not, because the problems you choose to take up and the ways you analyze those data sets and outcomes, the way you orient your outcomes, all of that is informed by values. Philosophers of science have said in the past that there may be a morally a neutral and objective view in science, but that is at the level of the inference, at the bench. Every other decision you make in the context of science is value informed. So again, if all that is true, then from the sciences all the way through humanities and ethics, there are these value decisions that go into our decision making. And so the tension here is the tension around what counts, what values. How do we balance moral concerns, which in this context, unfortunately, from my perspective, but I think just factually, are bound up with political differences, and epistemic constraints, like how do we balance truth and misinformation concerns as we're doing the work in the academy. And so I don't know what to do with that, except that I think it's really important space to open up conversations, because they continue to show up. We do, I think, exist in a bubble where we only read particular sets of things and hear particular views regularly. I'll give you one, but I actually don't think that's all that problematic. Because one of the other things that's happening, the last thing I wanted to say in my short tirade here that you're listening to maybe later on, is that another thing that came up in this podcast towards the end was that the problem of, or the nature of acceleration, they called it. And both conversants in this podcast agreed that acceleration was this problem, sort of driven by, or maybe as a result of, social media. We hear about cases much more regularly. Maybe it's not the case that there are a lot more cases. In fact, both sides kind of agreed that these problems of political balance are perpetual. But the hang up now is that we just, even if it's a small number of folks, their cases are so much louder because of propagation on social media. And again, that's nothing new, but the argument for novelty that one of the podcasters made was that now it's become an active strategy, right? Now one side of a political divide can use acceleration, information acceleration on social media to drive a point, right? To increase the volume or the intensity of a point being made culturally for bigger effect. And when that's taken up as an active strategy, that becomes real, that increases divisiveness and increases tensions. One example that's played out on our campus here at UCF was the first year of the pandemic, which for all I know might have been 2002 at this point, but I think it was 2020. Caitlin Bennett, the social media person nicknamed the Gun Girl, showed up on UCF's campus. She's a sort of conservative provocateur interested in gun rights and sort of against academic institutions. And so she kind of goes on tour. She's got support, let's say, to go on tour around university campuses to sort of enact free speech, right? So she showed up during the pandemic on UCF's campus. She got followed around by groups of grumpy students and used the opportunity through her impressive social media community audience to stir up divisiveness, to sort of say, oh, I was followed around by students who were all not respecting the 6 foot distancing mandate that was in place, and some of them weren't wearing masks, and see what's happening with free speech on campus. I'm getting oppressed here. And so it was this whole thing, and it was, again, intentional. I mean, that was the reason she was on campus. It wasn't that she wanted to speak freely to nobody because it was during a pandemic, but right, there was this sort of political usefulness strategy to her actions on campus. And that's just one example of this sort of enacting of this strategy of accelerating through social media information flows to build these divisiveness criteria. So again, I think there's really interesting ethical things to consider, and the big picture questions are are sort of like, what's the relationship between the work we do and our beliefs? One of the participants, and I think this was Lukianoff again, asked this really kind of weird question. He said, it wasn't really a question, it was an assertion. He said, can't you have horrible beliefs and still be good at your job? And he gave two examples. He gave the example of Isaac Newton, who was apparently an alchemist, and he says believes in the occult. We'll have to fact check that as well. That was one example. So somebody smart who also held horrible beliefs. And then smart people who are also racists was his other example. Right? So his idea was that you could be a horrible human being, right? You could be a racist occultist on his read and still be an excellent faculty member because you could still do good political science or philosophy or chemistry, right? And so there's no relationship on his read between somebody's character or their views, their beliefs, I guess, and their actions as a faculty member. Through the conversations we've had over the last year, we've sort of argued against that. If you think about all of the talk we've done about the relationship between character and actions and the way that what we believe informs how we do what we do. So it's a really interesting position to take, that it doesn't matter, right? That you could be a flat earther, or you could be, to stick with his example, a racist, and still do a good job as a faculty member. And the question is, like, again, comes back to these, are there sort of moral standards, or is everything just contextually or culturally subjective, right? Is there a way that we can say, no, it doesn't matter, right? Whether you enact it in your work as a mechanical engineer or not, if you're a racist, that still positions you with all these concerns about implicit bias, and it's going to come out in your work as a faculty member, and that's not appropriate, right? That's an ethically bad thing to be a racist. And if you can't make that claim, then again, as we've discussed in some of these topics, then you're functionally just a straight up relativist that thinks, like, as long as you've got some disciplinary constraints and you're, teaching your subject matter or whatever, then everything else is just up to you and me, right? My views are no better than your views, and like, we need some balance. We should have these views and these views, or X and minus X. We got to sort of run that gamut of beliefs. And if we've equity on that read is the full range, the full spectrum of beliefs represented in university faculty. And if you've got that, then the conservative critique that we've talked through here goes away, right? The idea that the university is no longer morally, the university is morally neutral not because everybody sort of looks at all sides of an argument, but because all sides of that argument are represented in its faculty by their beliefs. And I think there's tension there, right? There's one thing to say when we bring up a discussion, like free speech on campus, to look at both sides, which is what this podcaster has tried to do, right? Bringing in functionally an entrenched academic and a conservative critic and saying, like, let's talk through their positions side by side. There's that kind of neutrality. And then there's the representative, the mean neutrality, right? That on the mean of your faculty, you're neutral, but you've got really conservative voices and really liberal voices, to stick it in political terms, that are all represented. Those are two different views, and one has moral content to it, like a moral evaluative content, and one doesn't. And again, I've got my own views here, but I think that's the landscape as I've mapped it for this week. And I think I'd love to talk through this with folks. You can send us a note at centerforethics@ucf.edu. Let me know what you think. I'd really love to hear from you. And we can return to this topic in a future week. Thanks. And the last thing I'll say is we are scheduled to meet every 2 weeks at this time at 4:30 in the afternoon for an hour. But I'm understanding that folks have a lot going on. This might not be the best time. So the other thing you might do is send me a note to the same address, again, centerforethics@ucf.edu, and let me know if there's a better time, or if there's something we can do to help you engage. The point of this is a chance for us all to talk together. And while I always have things to say, I'd much rather hear from you all. So thanks for listening in, and I hope I'll see you in another couple of weeks.